Hello everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to another EUROCONTROL StraightTalk Live. This is the series of programs where we're lucky enough to talk to some of the aviation industry's leading players to work out what it is that we can do to turn the corner, what it is that we can do to build back better, and when we do build back better, what it is that we've built back, what will it look like? It's our enormous pleasure today to introduce the CEO of the Lufthansa Group, Mr. Carsten Spohr, and we'll be talking to him about the various issues to do with European and indeed long-haul and global aviation. But as is normal at Hard Talk, before we do that, I'll ask the DG of EUROCONTROL, Mr. Eamonn Brennan, if he'd be so kind as to give us an update both on Lufthansa's recent performance, but also on the market itself. Thanks very much, Eamonn.
Good afternoon from Brussels. Thank you, Andrew, and a special thanks today to Carsten Spohr, the Group CEO of Lufthansa, for joining us on StraightTalk. We really appreciate the view from one of Europe's largest aviation players and a really key player in the industry and in IATA and all the industry associations. So last week we looked at the traffic situation in Europe, and as you know, in the last number of days the situation has deteriorated considerably. So today we're expecting 9,000 flights, and just to put it in perspective, that's 36% of what we had in 2019. And the interesting thing is that we're now experiencing significant national measures. So we're in a third wave of the virus. We have quarantine situations. We have a slow rollout of the vaccine in some countries. But more importantly, and a consistent message we've been giving, is the inconsistency of national measures. It's very difficult to operate aviation where you have some countries looking for PCR tests, antigen, others antigen, 7-day quarantines versus 10-day quarantines, and also the whole uncertainty about vaccinations. Can you actually travel if you've got a vaccination? So there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and I'm sure Carsten and Andrew will explore this very much in the minutes ahead. So if I could just mention to you, the situation in the long haul, which is a very key market for Lufthansa, is critical at the moment. The Europe situation is we had a 67% reduction in traffic up to yesterday. But if you look, it's probably not as bad in the Atlantic, 49%. And you can see also traffic to, the Middle East is down 58%. So Europe is definitely experiencing the worst. What I would say at the moment is all that's flying at the moment in terms of operations in Europe is cargo operations, business jets, and a very limited skeleton service of traditional point-to-point. But for all intensive purposes, at the moment, we're reaching a low point in aviation that we haven't seen since the total stop of last April. So this is really significant. So if we look at Germany, you can see that the airports in Germany have been significantly affected, and we're comparing 2021 to 2019 here. You can see a huge drop in Frankfurt. Really what's interesting is that, Leipzig is now the second largest airport by volume terms in Germany, representing the cargo, and it goes right through the value chain, and this is what you see. And again, if you look at the routes from Germany, domestic operations, considerable reduction, but still the largest, and limited amount of operations. And these, I would add, are largely cargo operations to the United States and over to the Netherlands, etc. Not a large amount of traffic moving from anybody. So that's really significant. Also, I might just say that if we look at the situation with Lufthansa, and Carsten, I'm sure, will outline this in much more detail, we've seen mainline Lufthansa operating only 204 flights yesterday, an 86% reduction of where we were last year. So this is really significant. Let's now just take a moment and look how the major carriers have actually adopted over the last number of weeks to the virus. It's worth looking at where Lufthansa fits into this. And you can see that as we've gone through the weeks, there's been a very similar pattern with Ryanair, IAG, and also Lufthansa and Air France. And you can see it's gone up and down, and it's followed the pattern of the virus over the last number of weeks. So it's quite an interesting pattern to see. But the message I'm giving you this week from Brussels is huge capacity cuts. The airlines are removing flights from the schedule, and really the requirement for advanced testing is causing a complete stop in the system. So just finally, Our traffic scenarios that we published have been largely accurate. We currently have a 62% reduction. But the bad news is that next week we will issue a new set of scenarios and we're trending downwards. So we're seeing a very significant reduction. February is going to be very bleak and we don't see any significant improvement till after Easter. So Andrew and Carsten, I look forward to a very good Straight Talk. Thank you both very much and the best of luck.
Carsten Spohr, welcome to Straight Talk. Thanks very much for joining us. It's not the happiest video in the history of the world, I suspect it's fair to say. Are you optimistic about 2021?
Well, Andrew, good afternoon from Frankfurt, first of all, to you, and of course to all the friends in the industry and the friends of the industry watching and listening. I think one way or another, 21 will be a year of recovery. I'm convinced of that. The first quarter, I think, unfortunately plays out the way we had planned it, basically flat, in our case, with less than 20% of our capacity operating. On the other hand, I'm sure that somewhere between the second and third quarter, I think the vaccination effect will come into place. Testing becomes more and more professionalized, which we have been pushing for some time. Hopefully quarantine will eventually be pushed back by testing and vaccination. And that, I think, will give us a sharp recovery somewhere around the summer period. Is this going to be going up to a total of 40% for the whole year, 50% or 60%? We don't know. In our case, the group has planned for all three percentages to play out for the whole year. I'm sure, or hope at least, we won't be much off either way. Cargo is a different story. We had a great start into cargo, just like last year, ended up, in a record-breaking fashion. We have decided to maintain more MD-11s in the fleet than we actually had planned. We even took seats out of a few passenger aircraft again to keep them in the air as freighters. So an interesting year ahead of us. There's never a boring year in aviation. You all know that, but this year could be a very interesting year indeed.
So in the video, we saw a reference to your Renew program and the sort of restructuring that you've been forced to do in the last year. I remember listening to you one stage last year and you said that you were losing a million euros an hour, although I then heard you later and said you'd much improved that. You got up to €1 million every 90 minutes or down to €1 million every 90 minutes. What sort of restructuring have you done and what sort of restructuring do you think you need to do from here?
I think it's important to know that, of course, such a crisis, such a unique crisis is first of all a threat, and we all treated it as a threat in 2020. And like all global players, also Lufthansa needed to turn to governments to stabilize the business. But indeed, I think it's a unique opportunity as well to come out as a more leaner company. And I even believe there is a huge opportunity when it comes to sustainability. I'm sure we'll touch on that later on. So in our Renew program, we indeed decided that we need to come out smaller, because I do believe it will take many years before we go back, at least in Western Europe, before we go back to the 19 record level of revenue and passenger numbers, and to be more efficient in our structure. So that's what we call Renew. And to use the numbers you just quoted, we indeed started with 1 million lost per hour, and while we speak, we are down to 1 million every 2 hours, so which is a significant improvement, still hurting, but it shows that for our standards, I think the cost cutting has gone a lot faster than what we would have thought. But there's a few things we need to do which go beyond the pandemic. So we have decided to shut down 2 airlines within the Lufthansa Group. We started with 14 airlines. We'll come out of the pandemic with 12 airlines only. We took 4 engine aircraft out. We grounded the whole 380 fleet. We took the 340-600 out, and we don't plan to bring them back into the air. So there's a significant fleet modernization happening by the fact that we're now a smaller airline and therefore can, but just by the pure nature of the math behind it, modernize our fleet faster. And as a matter of fact, by the end of last year, every 5th staff member has left the group. We started with 135,000 people. And 29,000 people left, and it's just 106,000 people left now while we speak, and there will be more people who will leave. So that was the sad part of it, but of course it has to be done to adjust for the new normal and to survive the crisis per se.
Was there ever a time early on in the absolute crisis when you were losing 1 million an hour Were you thought of just simply grounding the airline and putting up all the shutters and waiting for all this to finish? Why did you keep flying?
Well, we very early, indeed, in the pandemic, when the magnitude became obvious, which of course it took us a few weeks like everybody, we decided we only fly whatever creates a positive cash contribution, which brought us into a situation where we brought down more flights from the schedule than some of our competitors. But indeed, until today, we just maintain that part of the network, which creates positive cash. We were forced to decide to more or less allocate connecting traffic to one hub instead of the 5 we usually operate. So the other 4 hubs are running on a minimum. That helped. And of course, the cargo contribution helped. There's some flights from Swiss, by example, where even blocked the passenger compartment. We just use the bellies and still make a positive cash contribution. In the Lufthansa main line, we usually open up the passenger compartment, and sometimes just a few people on board on the transatlantic, still we make some money on it. So I think it was not a philosophical discussion. We ended up on a business-based discussion, and that's what we are operating today while we speak.
Right. You also got, of course, 9 billion euros from the German government. Does that mean we're heading back to 1944 and state-owned airlines?
Well, maybe first of all, we got up to 9 billion from the government. At this point, we just took 3. And I actually don't believe we will need the whole 9, depending how the year will play out. But that was just an amount of money which is the maximum contribution. And even that is such a huge number, by the way. The 3 billion we took so far is probably among the lowest percentages with the European players, including low-cost players, when you put it into ratio to the turnover of our airline. So it's a big number, no doubt. We're grateful for the 5 home governments who helped us. But let's see that this is, again, on the lower end, and hopefully will not go above the 3, or at least not too much more, looking into the next month. Government ownership, which is probably what you're referring to. Okay, would I ever have thought that we go back to, in our case, 20% government ownership after we privatized in 95? No. But it's even more amazing with our 20%, we are the lower end, among the lowest in Europe compared to our 2 big hub competitors, and surely lower than those airlines to the east of us. So I think that indeed cannot be a way back to government ownerships in the western part of the world. I think we need to, in our case, pay back the loan. This is what people also sometimes forget. It's not money for free. It's credits, loan, debt you have to pay back. In our case, there's even incentives built in to do that fast, because money gets quite expensive after a few years. I'm sure our competitors will try to do the same. Once you are believing in free ownership without government involvement, I think that's where the industry will go back to as soon as the financial situation allows it to do so.
So how do you see the industry looking in 5 years from now? Well, yeah, let's assume we get through this dip. And how do you see both European aviation and then international aviation 5 years from now?
Well, maybe let's start with the global picture. Our view, also before the pandemic, has been there is really 12 global players, which in our view are there to stay. You got the 3 big US players, you got the 3 big Chinese players, there's 3 big players on the Bosporus and Gulf, and there's 3 big players in Europe. And the 12 of us, I think, will do whatever they can to maintain their global competitiveness among each other. And I think that number is there to stay also in 5 to 10 years. Of course, there's many other great successful airlines on top of this, but these are the 12 really large global players. I think they'll be there. In terms of the ranking within, if you look at the 4 biggest by turnover, there's 4 of these 12 who have a turnover of more than 40 billion US, which is the 3 American players and us. I would think that within 5 years, not even 10, there will be a couple Chinese players among us in the top group. So Lufthansa will do their very best to stay among the top 4 and 5, but I think there will be Chinese getting in. So that, I think, is a major change. And on top of that, in the US, you have 2 more or less point-to-point oriented airlines. I think we see anywhere between 1 and 3 point-to-point airlines in Europe within the next 5 years. They mainly compete with each other, and they compete with the point-to-point airlines which are attached to the big airline groups. So that, I think, will continue. Shift between point-to-point and hub traffic is difficult to say. I would say the next years you see a shift towards the hubs, because with less volumes, many O&Ds cannot be served anymore point to point directly. The remaining passengers have to travel via a hub like 10, 20 years ago, because that's the volumes we'll be seeing for a while. But I think long term, with also smaller long range aircraft, we definitely believe that's why we keep up our multi-hub strategy. The mega hubs probably will have a more difficult time than smaller hubs, which are preferred by their passengers for the quality of the transfer product. And modern smaller aircraft allow that to be just as efficient as the big mega hubs were in the last years.
That's really interesting. Did you deliberately create the 5-hub strategy with the intention of making smaller hubs than some of the really big hubs that your competitors have?
Well, we didn't create these hubs in the middle of nowhere. We took, in our view, some of the richest catchments in Europe. And the history of Lufthansa has always been that the two most interesting catchments in Europe, Paris and London, obviously were our competitors. And the third largest catchment in Europe, which is the Düsseldorf region, obviously there was not an airport there which could have been used for a hub. So we were forced decades ago to establish something initially in Frankfurt, which by hub efficiency bypassed the disadvantage of not being in such a huge catchment as some of the others, a little bit like our competitors did in Amsterdam. So we added to that smaller but large catchments, which had their own local strength in market strength to allow for a hub operation of some nature. The one example probably is Munich, which really didn't start as a hub, but it was built into a hub by us. But that is probably an exception because there was an extraordinary cooperation between the Munich airport and Lufthansa. And at that time, our other hub was both full and too expensive. So we shifted traffic to Munich and created quite a big hub operation there. But the other hubs, be it Zurich, be it Brussels, be it Vienna, basically grew out of a local catchment and decades of national carrier operations, which we then, of course, tried to optimize in our multi-hub system. Also to create some competition between airports. Airports are local monopolies, so if you want them to compete, you need a multi-hub system where you can reroute traffic.
Indeed, indeed. So on the rerouting traffic, do you see then on the hubbing traffic will continue to fly on small Lufthansa aeroplanes, but the point-to-point traffic will be on Eurowings? Is that how it comes out?
Oh, absolutely. At least in Germany, but also in Austria to a certain degree, we have the premium brand, Lufthansa in the one case, Austrian in the other case, and then a second brand on top of that, which is Eurowings, which plays indeed more on a point-to-point model, or in the case of long range, focuses more on leisure-oriented markets where you have lower yields and therefore need for a lower cost. And in Switzerland, obviously, that works similar with Swiss and Edelweiss. So I think that model, asking about a 5-year time frame, will be there. We're actually building up that model while we speak, rebuilding it from the situation we all were in. And I think the two brands for each country is probably covering the needs of the market quite well.
So what about Belgium? What's the story there?
Well, it's a much smaller market, so we focus on one brand there, Brussels Airlines, which has this very unique USP with its African traffic. And by the way, of all the hubs, the one we shrunk least in the last months was actually the long range, in terms of long range, was Brussels, because it has such a strong network into Africa, which worked quite well over the last month due to VFR traffic and lack of other travel options.
So just to come back to state ownership for a moment, you made a reference to carriers to the east of you, which I assume is both the Gulf and China. How do you see that competition playing out? You worked very hard as the A4E and as Lufthansa to get an agreement between Europe and Qatar, but since that was originally negotiated, you've worked very hard to get it not signed or finalised. Do you have any hope for competition with the Gulf and the eastern carriers?
Well, see, we have less an issue with ownership. Our strong point, and we have been lobbying that for decades, is fair competition. I think people tend to forget that out of all the industries which are in a local competitive situation, there's two which are not part of the WTO, which is agriculture and aviation. So you need other frameworks to create a level playing field. And we have been, of course, asking our politicians to do that, to ensure that. And whereas somebody like us taking on government ownership is facing a long list of limitations and additional burdens by that government ownership, in other parts of the world, government ownerships allows for endless opportunities, including continuing to operate even without passengers to a certain degree, because there's no such thing as a P&L. So that, I think, is something we have not changed our position on. We want to make sure that Europe is connecting itself and not just connected by others. We need a level playing field, and that, unfortunately, as it cannot be achieved by the WTO as in other industries, needs to be done by bilateral agreements, be them among countries or among the EU and other countries.
So should aviation go into the WTO framework? Would that be a solution?
I think it would be a solution, but it's not realistic because there's so many restrictions which would apply to some of these carriers you are mentioning that their governments, who are very close to those airlines, will never approve aviation to be part of. So I think it will, for the time to come, be bilateral agreements. Again, absolutely fine if they are done by the European Commission, but then they have to have the same standards of a level playing field as bilateral agreements among countries would or should. And I think the next 5 to 10 years will show how that will play out. But of course, the pandemic, with 10,000 of European aviation jobs being at stake, Lufthansa alone, as I mentioned, had to let go 29,000 people. I think there's even more a need to make sure that level playing field exists and we don't export jobs to other parts of the world.
So thank you. I'm going to come back to that a little bit in a moment, I think. But what about competition within Europe? How do you see competition within Europe, both now and 5 years from now?
Well, probably Europe is one of the most competitive markets when it comes to intra-European competition, which you see in terms of fares. We are among the lowest fares in the world are within Europe. You can fly it sometimes for €9 for a couple hours. I mean, that is, in my view, crazy, as I've said many times, but it shows how the competition in Europe plays out. So I'm not worried about that. Of course, on top of flights on many O&Ds, you even have the train as a competitor. So I think the European consumer is enjoying very low fares by that competition. Now the new discussion, of course, not new, but resurfacing is sustainability. So do we want people to fly for 2 hours for €9? Is there better means of transport? Is there a certain minimum fares where flying should be allowed to be taking place, which some people strongly oppose, others are in favor of? So I think we're in the very middle of that discussion, but the competition in Europe, I'm sure, will stay. If it needs to be happening between €9 and €10, we'll see, but I'm not worried on this on behalf of our consumers.
The competition and sustainability point overlap here, don't they? Apart from a €9 flight, the new European Sustainable Mobility Package is trying to phase out flights of under 500 kilometres. Will that have an impact on Lufthansa, do you think, or more likely on some of your competitors?
Well, we saw that, for example, in France, where, of course, an exception was made for connecting traffic. And I expect that to happen because otherwise, if you want to travel from Nuremberg to Los Angeles, you wouldn't be allowed to go via Frankfurt anymore, but you would be forced to go via London, which I'm sure is not what people have in mind. Or you take a detour via Istanbul, which surely doesn't help the CO2 trend either. So I think when it comes to connecting traffic, at least in our case, we have given up all these routes where the train provides a competitive product, thinking about Cologne, Frankfurt, or Stuttgart, Frankfurt. And even on local O&D direct routes like Berlin, Hamburg, we actually stopped flying because the train offers such a great product. So we're very much a fan of intermodal optimization. We very much support that airports, hub airports, should have a link to the train system. And wherever they do, like in Frankfurt, or now the new airport in Berlin, or the airport in Düsseldorf, we see that that takes away the need for short-range flights.
What about your competitors, and specifically, I guess I mean the low-cost carriers who've made a point who've made a business model out of doing point-to-point? Do you think they're going to be more adversely affected than you?
Well, when I think about my competitive landscape, the first two I think about is my European hub competitors. And then I think about my global hub competitors, and the point-to-point or the low-cost carriers in Europe basically are competing with our subsidiary Eurowings. So we are in a similar situation when it comes to Eurowings as them. When it comes to our global hub model, we compare ourselves to others. But I think when it comes to regulation, definitely I would think that governments will rather support the model of hubs, like the French government has, which has been much more strict in their ruling on point-to-point traffic than on their connecting traffic. So you're probably right. But I leave that to the politicians. We are affected either way because we operate both business models.
Well, indeed. I mean, you may wake up thinking about your hub competitors, but I guess the CEO of Eurowings doesn't do that. But but another place where all the politics and competition overlap, of course, is in slots. We've seen some, depending on your perspective, either some very sensible slot policies in this crisis or some extraordinarily retroactive slot policies. Do you think the European Commission is getting it right on slots?
Well, I think if you look at the global landscape, the majority is going a different way than the European Commission, be it in the US, be it in China, be it in Latin America, Russia, or even the UK. They have already decided to extend their slot waiver. And it's only the European Commission, for some reason, which has not even followed the compromise the industry has suggested jointly with the airport. So that is surprising. There's discussion going on while we speak. But I'm positive because what happens if you don't have a slot waiver? Any airline like us who depends on the hub system will do whatever it takes to safeguard their slots. If we have to fly empty, we'll probably offer €9 tickets ourselves to keep those flights in the system, because giving up slots, giving up essential slots at a hub, is a damage to generations of Lufthansa staff or Air France staff or British Airways staff or KLM staff to come. So I think no responsible hub airline management will do so. On the one hand, the European Commission wants to reduce the CO2 footprint. On the other hand, if they would force us to fly empty, that'd be crazy. I think would be public very quickly, and that's why I'm still optimistic that the slot waiver, one way or another, will be extended. But
there's a contradiction there, isn't there? You said earlier on that part of what you're doing is reducing your size. You've sadly lost 20% of your staff. You've reduced. So why do you still need the slots as if it's not, partying like it's 2019?
Well, it's the other way around. If we decide, or airlines decide, to shrink and to give up slots, then of course other airlines are happy to take those. And that's why there was a compromise in the system that some slot series you would basically block by handing them in. Others would need to be served 50%, for example. So I think there is some mechanism built in there, which is fine. But I think even when you shrink a hub airline to a certain degree, when it comes to your essential slots at 7 o'clock in the morning, where you're building your long range, bank, or 9 o'clock in our case, the North Atlantic bank starting an hour later, and nobody would give up a slot in this regard. And you need to have these slots to, build the connectivity, which is the essential core of your system.
So that's true. That's true then, obviously, at Frankfurt and at London and Charles de Gaulle and what have you. But what about across the entire system? Is there scope, do you think, for reform and change?
No, I think we have made suggestions in terms of reform. I mean, been the chairman of IATA for now a year and a half, and we made joint suggestions with Airlines Council the Airport Council in the world. So it's absolutely fine to look into this. But again, you need to have, the ability for the hub airlines to maintain their business model on the one hand, and that cannot change every quarter or every semester. And I think also, again, when it now comes to the slot waivers, which is a unique situation in the pandemic, I think we have a responsibility towards the environment as well. And again, the rest of the world has already agreed to do this. I would be surprised if the Europeans would not follow quickly.
Well, so far. Moving on from slots perhaps directly to airports, which is sort of connected. You mentioned earlier that Lufthansa and Munich Airport have got a very strong relationship, which has obviously benefited Munich very well. Do you see that sort of relationship developing in other airports around the world?
Well, first of all, it didn't only help Munich Airport, it also helped Lufthansa. Huh?
For sure.
We're able to offer a connecting product in Munich, which probably is second to none, at least in Europe. And that only works when you work very closely with each other. And in our case, you own the terminal together, so you can do a lot of things you otherwise would never be able to do. And of course, there's many airports in the world where the focus is profitability and not that much offering a competitive product to build for the future and to build for the area around it. I think in Munich, the airport is owned by the government. Their view is to enhance aviation for the good of the global economy and the global population, the local economy and the local population, which is probably behind building an airport rather than maximizing profits for some pension fund who owns it. So I think that is a political question to decide how to use an airport best. On the airline point of view, we just need to either have competition, which is very difficult because almost all airports are local monopolies, or you need a regulation which makes sure that those monopolies are not abused. And I think that's what we are continuously discussing in Brussels, also with the airports. Surely there's a different view there. But I think that discussion has been quite professional over the last years. And I think both views have been exchanged. And it shows, as I've said, in our case, partnerships work. If I look to some other partnerships in Europe, I also think that shows. And if you look to the east of Germany, of Europe, surely their partnerships between airports and airlines owned by the same governments work quite well. So I think there's more proof of concept than just Munich and Lufthansa.
Of course, I don't 100% agree on your natural monopoly argument. And I look to Australia, where we have they have a completely different regulatory model and yet a very, very competitive airport area. Do you believe airports can compete?
Well, if there's more than one airport in a certain location, maybe, and they don't owned by the same entity, maybe there is such a thing as competition. And then, of course, there is competition for connecting passengers when they are, like in our case, you operate a multi-hub system, in our case with 5 hubs, which are close to each other or close enough to each other that you actually can reroute traffic. Then I think we created some competition for the connecting passenger. But when it comes to the local passenger, there is no such thing. Like a local train station has no competitor, a local airport has no competitor. So I think, in short, the answer to your question is no.
Okay, let's move on to ANSPs. 15 years later, Carsten, why don't we have a single European sky? We've got a single European currency. We've got a single European aviation market.
Well, I think it's one of the big frustrations. I probably should have said that when you said, what's European aviation going to be like in 5 to 10 years? I probably should have said, we will still be fighting for a single European sky. Well, we all know, and that was proven again in the pandemic, aviation is seen as something still very national. There is an interest of governments to have a hand on this. And obviously, there's no competition among the NSPs. So there is not such thing as consolidation. Or the typical mechanisms of free markets are just not at play. And that's also the reason why, with all the efficiency out there, the single European sky, which in a market environment would have been created because it's so much more efficient, doesn't happen. But nevertheless, I have hope, and I've been on this topic many years. Just to do it for money obviously didn't happen, but now we do it for the environment, because we all know that there's detours, delays, more CO2 footprint than necessary by the lack of efficiency. And I think that new currency of CO2, doing the best for our planet for the next generations, creates new energy to create a single European sky, which we have not seen when it was just about money and passenger convenience. So there's new energy in my view.
Right. It's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, I've never understood why the airlines aren't demanding that ATM be a competitive component of their service delivery. All I ever seem to hear is airlines complaining about price. They never complain about quality. They never complain about value. Do you think there's going to be a change in the way the airlines approach ATM reform?
Well, I'll take you up to even motivate me more to speak about this in the future. I think we have, look at the year 2018. I mean, the number one topic for all airlines was to complain about, security checks at airports and the air traffic management not being able to be honest, on record loads of the system to generate an on-time and reliable air traffic management. So I think the complaints, not just about money, but also about the inefficiency of the system, have been there. I mean, I was a pilot many years on the 340. It was so obvious that when you left Los Angeles, you would get a direct vector to the border of Canada. And one day, even Canada and the US started to cooperate, and you will get a vector on the Atlantic. And where are we flying any aircraft through Europe? So I think it's not just about the cost, it's about detours, it's about inefficiency, additional radio calls, and all these, which I think are just leaving us ways behind, years behind what others are doing and could be done. Not just on price, also on efficiency.
You raised another really interesting point, moving away from ATM for a moment. You were a pilot. I guess I could say you are a pilot. Do you think that there'll be any more airline CEOs that are pilots?
I was young and needed the money. So it's a personal situation, I think, for all of us. Well, if I look at my own country, on top of many large German corporations, you tend to have engineers or people who know their stuff. So I think it was and is helpful to understand aviation from the basics of it by being a pilot, but it's not required. There's many successful airline CEOs who are not, and there are some who are. So I think it helps. It helps me every day. I think it helps when it comes to communication with your staff, but it's surely not required, as we can see on many successful competitors of mine.
Indeed. And I think once a lot of airline CEOs were pilots, but increasingly the pilots have sort of been pushed off. I mean this nicely, but pushed off to one side as the economics of actually running a business, not an airline, have come into play. Speaking as an ex-airline executive myself, I have fairly firm views on some of that. But you've managed to negotiate quite a good agreement with your body of pilots, haven't you, as part of this downsizing and the whole renew thing? Is that am I seeing that right? You seem to have lost fewer pilots as a percentage than you have the rest of the staff.
Well, it was always our view that preferable to firing people, we rather bring down the workload of every individual, spread out the reduced work in an innovative way. And by those part-time models, we can keep people on board. It took a lot longer with the pilots than I would have thought, and unfortunately it's only an agreement until the first quarter of 22, which means very soon we have to negotiate again, which I think is not a good situation for the spirit of an airline in times when you need to stick together and try to survive the crisis. So I would have loved to have a longer agreement like we were able to achieve it with our cabin union, for example, in Germany. And I think on behalf of the pilots, it would have been better because you're sitting at home with your family and don't know what will happen to you in March next year. So I'm happy that we have reached an agreement. I'm happy that we kept everybody on board by that agreement, at least in the main line. It's not true for the other airlines in the group where people had to leave, but I would much have preferred to have a longer lasting agreement, giving more peace also to the individual, but there's always two for tango. So very soon we meet at the negotiating table again. But surely the company will be smaller. We have a redundancy, and it's either less people or less work per pilot, and that's what needs to be negotiated.
Right. So, Carsten, my last question always is the question that what more do you think EUROCONTROL can do to help European aviation as we go forward, hopefully to a better future?
Well, I think we need players, and EUROCONTROL is one of them, who keep on pushing for more efficiency in the system. Because the one thing I see a lot of attention on is competitiveness among European players. And again, that is there, and you see it on the fares coming down now for many, many years. But when it comes to efficiency in the system, especially compared to systems outside of Europe, I don't hear those voices strongly enough. And I think EUROCONTROL can play a role there. They have been pushing for modernization of the system. They have been pushing the NSBs around Europe to become more efficient. So I would like to ask all of you, keep that up and keep your Irish CEO.
We'll do what we can on that. Thank you so much for that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was really fascinating, really detailed, but really wonderfully complex, and a great window into what airline CEOs are going through at the moment. Keeping up the tradition of Irish CEOs, I'm delighted to announce that the next Straight Talk is indeed with the CEO of Qantas, who is actually Irish, Mr. Alan Joyce. We have a very busy schedule of Straight Talks coming up. Do please pay attention to those and make sure you join us. I'm delighted that you are able to be here today, and I thank Carsten again one more time. So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a very good day.